The stagecoach wheels kicked up a cloud of dust that seemed to hang in the Nevada air like a portent as Grace Vaughn clutched her leather satchel and wondered if she had made the worst mistake of her life. It was August 1887, and the mining town of Rhyolite sprawled before her like a promise half-kept, with its ramshackle buildings and sun-bleached wood storefronts lining a main street that looked like it had been carved from the desert itself. She stepped down from the coach, her sensible brown traveling dress already coated in a fine layer of grit, and took in the sight of what would be her new home. The schoolhouse stood at the far end of town, a modest structure that looked barely capable of withstanding the harsh desert winds. Grace was 22 years old, educated at a women's college in Boston, and utterly unprepared for the reality of frontier life despite all her reading and mental preparation. Her father had died 6 months earlier, leaving her with debts she could never hope to repay on a seamstress's wages. Teaching in the West paid 3 times what she could earn back east, and desperation had a way of making even the most daunting prospects seem reasonable. "Miss Vaughn," a woman's voice cut through her reverie. Grace turned to see a plump, middle-aged woman in a calico dress approaching with a warm smile. "I'm Martha Henderson, the postmaster's wife. We have been expecting you." "It is very nice to meet you, Mrs. Henderson," Grace said, extending her hand. The woman's grip was firm and surprisingly calloused. "Let me help you with your trunk. My husband will bring it along shortly. I have prepared a room for you at our house. It is not much, but it is clean and private." Martha's eyes were kind, but Grace could see the assessment happening behind them. She knew what the woman was thinking. Eastern educated, refined manners probably would not last 3 months before running back to civilization. The Henderson home was a 2-story building attached to the post office, constructed of weathered pine that had turned silver gray in the relentless sun. The room Martha showed her to was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the main street. Grace set her satchel down and removed her hat, catching sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand. Her dark blonde hair was falling loose from its pins, and her gray eyes looked larger than usual in her dust-smudged face. "The water in the pitcher is fresh," Martha said. "Supper will be at 6. The school board will want to meet you tomorrow morning, but tonight you should rest. The journey from Carson City is not an easy one." After Martha left, Grace poured water into the basin and washed her face and hands, watching the water turn brown with desert dust. Through the window, she could see men moving along the street, most wearing the rough clothes of miners or ranch hands. Horses were tied to hitching posts, and somewhere a piano played badly out of tune. This was nothing like Boston, nothing like the orderly, civilized world she had known. But that world had offered her nothing but poverty and pity, and she had never been one to accept either gracefully. The next morning dawned bright and merciless, the sun already fierce by the time Grace made her way to the schoolhouse for her meeting with the school board. 3 men waited for her inside the building, which smelled of chalk dust and pine sap. The eldest introduced himself as Reverend Thomas Colby, a lean man with steel-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades under the western sun. The other 2 were local businessmen, one who owned the general store and another who ran the assay office. "We are pleased to have you, Miss Vaughn," Reverend Colby said, though his tone suggested he was reserving judgment. "Our last teacher left rather suddenly." She found the isolation difficult to bear. "I am not afraid of hard work or solitude," Grace replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I came here to teach, and that is precisely what I intend to do." The Reverend's expression softened slightly. You will have approximately 20 students, ranging from 6 to 15 years old. Some of them have had very little formal education. Their parents are miners, ranch hands, and laborers. They are good children for the most part, but they can be rough around the edges. Grace spent the rest of the morning exploring the schoolhouse and taking inventory of the supplies. There were slates and chalk, a few battered primers, and a collection of readers in various states of disrepair. She would need to write to Boston and have some of her own books sent out. The salary would not be generous, but it would be enough to live on and to slowly chip away at her father's debts. She was sweeping the floor when the door opened and a tall figure blocked the sunlight. Grace straightened, pushing a loose strand of hair from her face, and found herself looking at a man who seemed to embody everything she had imagined about the West. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscled build of someone who spent his days doing hard physical labor. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and his eyes were a striking shade of blue that seemed startling against his sun-bronzed skin. He wore dusty work clothes and a hat that had seen better days. "Can I help you?" Grace asked, trying to keep her voice level despite the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat. The man removed his hat, revealing more of his angular face. "I am Russell Ashford. My daughter will be one of your students. I wanted to introduce myself and make sure you had everything you needed." His voice was deep and measured, with the slight drawl that many of the Western men seemed to have. Grace set the broom aside and brushed off her hands. "Mr. Ashford, it is nice to meet you. How old is your daughter?" 8. Her name is Sarah." Something flickered across his face, a shadow of old pain. "Her mother passed when she was born. It has been just the two of us since then." "I am sorry for your loss," Grace said quietly. "I lost my father recently, so I understand something of grief." Russell's expression shifted, becoming somehow more present, more focused on her. "Then you understand why a good education matters so much. I want Sarah to have opportunities, to be able to read and write properly. I want her to have more than this town can offer if that is what she chooses." There was an intensity in his gaze that made Grace's breath catch. She had met many men in Boston, polished gentlemen with good manners and elegant conversation, but none of them had ever looked at her the way Russell Ashford was looking at her now, as if she were someone who mattered, someone whose presence made a difference. "I will do my best for all my students," Grace said, "including Sarah." Russell nodded slowly. "I run a cattle ranch about 5 miles north of town. If you ever need anything at all, you can send word. We take care of our own out here." After he left, Grace found herself standing in the empty schoolhouse, still feeling the weight of his presence even though he was gone. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She had not come to Nevada to become entangled with a rancher, no matter how compelling his blue eyes might be. She had come to build a new life, to prove that she was more than the debts her father had left behind. The first day of school arrived with all the chaos Grace had anticipated. 23 children of varying ages crowded into the schoolhouse, eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Some were clean and neatly dressed. Others looked like they had rolled out of bed and come straight to school without bothering to wash. Grace stood at the front of the room, her heart pounding, and introduced herself. "Good morning. I am Miss Vaughn, and I will be your teacher. I know some of you may have had teachers before, and some of you may be new to school entirely. We will be learning reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography. I expect you all to work hard and treat each other with respect." A boy in the back row, who looked to be about 14, leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed. "What is a fancy Eastern lady going to teach us about anything useful?" Grace met his challenging gaze without flinching. "I am going to teach you how to think, how to express yourself clearly, and how to understand the world beyond this town. Whether or not you find that useful is entirely up to you." The boy's smirk faded slightly. Before he could respond, a small girl in the front row raised her hand. She had dark hair in two neat braids and the same striking blue eyes that Grace recognized immediately. "Yes," Grace said encouragingly. "Are you really from Boston? My papa says Boston is where they have the biggest libraries in the whole country." Grace smiled. "You must be Sarah." "And yes, I am from Boston, and the libraries there are indeed very impressive. Have you ever thought about what you might want to read if you could go to one of those libraries?" Sarah's face lit up. "Everything. I want to read everything." The ice broken, the rest of the day proceeded more smoothly than Grace had dared hope. She assessed the children's skill levels, assigned them to reading groups, and began to establish the routines that would govern their days. By the time she dismissed them at 3 o'clock, she was exhausted but cautiously optimistic. Sarah lingered after the other children had left, carefully stacking slates and straightening the benches. Grace watched her work, noting the precise, careful movements that suggested a child who took pride in doing things properly. "Thank you for your help, Sarah," Grace said. "You do not have to stay, though. I am sure your father will be expecting you." "He is coming to pick me up," Sarah said. "He always does on the first day of school. He worries." She said it matter-of-factly, without embarrassment. As if summoned by the words, Russell appeared in the doorway. His gaze found his daughter first, and the naked love in his expression made something tighten in Grace's chest. Then his eyes moved to her, and she saw a question there. "How did she do?" he asked. "Sarah is a wonderful student," Grace said truthfully. "She reads very well for her age, and her penmanship is excellent. You have clearly been working with her at home." Russell's face showed obvious relief and pride. "Her mother was educated. Before she died, she made me promise that Sarah would be too. I do my best, but I am just a rancher. There is only so much I can teach her." "You have taught her what matters most," Grace said. "You have taught her that learning is valuable." Sarah was looking between them with an expression of intense interest that made Grace suddenly self-conscious. Russell must have noticed too, because he cleared his throat and settled his hat more firmly on his head. "Come on, Sarah girl. We need to get home before dark. Miss Vaughn has had a long day." As they walked toward the door, Sarah turned back. "Miss Vaughn, will you come to dinner at our ranch sometime? Papa is a very good cook." Grace saw the surprise and something that might have been panic flash across Russell's face, but Sarah was watching her with such hopeful eyes that she could not bring herself to refuse. "That would be lovely," Grace said carefully, "if your father does not mind the imposition." Russell recovered his composure quickly. "You would be welcome any time. Sunday, perhaps. After church," Grace agreed, and then they were gone, leaving her alone in the schoolhouse with the lingering scent of dust and chalk and something else, something that might have been possibility. The week passed in a blur of lesson planning and getting to know her students. Grace discovered that she enjoyed teaching far more than she had anticipated. There was something deeply satisfying about watching a child's face light up with understanding, about seeing them master a skill they had struggled with. Even the boy who had challenged her on the first day, whose name was Thomas, began to grudgingly participate in lessons. Sunday arrived bright and clear, and Grace dressed carefully in her best day dress, a soft blue cotton that brought out the gray of her eyes. Martha Henderson had offered to lend her the wagon to drive out to the Ashford ranch, and Grace accepted gratefully, though she was nervous about managing the horse. "Russell Ashford is a good man," Martha said as she helped Grace up onto the wagon seat. "He has had a hard road since his wife died. Sarah is the light of his life." The drive north took about 40 minutes, following a rough track that wound through sagebrush and scattered Joshua trees. The landscape was stark but beautiful in its own way, all muted greens and browns under an impossibly blue sky. Grace could see why people came here, why they stayed despite the harshness. There was a kind of freedom in all this open space, a sense that anything might be possible. The Ashford Ranch appeared on the horizon like an oasis. The house was a sturdy structure built of adobe and wood, with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides. There were several outbuildings, corrals with horses, and cattle grazing in the distance. Russell emerged from the barn as she drove up, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You made it," he said, and there was genuine pleasure in his voice. He helped her down from the wagon with a hand on her elbow, and Grace was acutely aware of the strength in his grip, the calluses on his palm. "Sarah has been watching for you since dawn." Sarah burst from the house at that moment, confirming his words. She had traded her school dress for pants and a shirt, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. "Miss Vaughn, come see the puppies. Our dog had puppies last month and they are so sweet." Grace laughed and allowed herself to be dragged toward the barn, with Russell following at a more sedate pace. The puppies were indeed sweet, tumbling bundles of fur that yipped and licked at Sarah's hands. Grace knelt down, heedless of her dress, and let one of the puppies climb into her lap. "They are beautiful," she said. "What kind of dogs are they?" "Working dogs," Russell said from behind her. "Their mother is the best cattle dog I have ever had. These pups will be worth their weight in gold once they are trained." Grace looked up at him, shading her eyes against the sun that streamed through the barn door. He was silhouetted against the light, tall and solid, and something in her chest did a small, unexpected flip. She looked away quickly, focusing on the puppy in her lap. Dinner was a simple affair of roasted chicken, potatoes and vegetables from the garden Russell maintained behind the house. They ate at a rough-hewn table in a kitchen that was surprisingly tidy and well organized. Sarah chattered throughout the meal, telling Grace about the ranch, about the cattle, about her favorite horse. Russell listened with obvious affection, occasionally adding a detail or gently correcting an exaggeration. "Sarah tells me you can read Latin," Russell said during a pause in his daughter's monologue. "That is impressive." Grace felt herself blush slightly. "My father believed in thorough education for women. It was somewhat unconventional, but I am grateful for it now." "What brought you out here?" Russell asked. "A woman with your education could have taught anywhere." The question was direct, and Grace considered deflecting it. But there was something about the quiet kitchen, about the way Russell was looking at her with genuine interest rather than judgment, that made her want to be honest. "My father died and left significant debts," she said quietly. "The wages for teaching in the East would not have been enough to repay them. Coming west was the only practical option." Russell's expression softened. "That took courage, or desperation," Grace said with a small smile. "Sometimes they amount to the same thing." After dinner, Sarah showed Grace around the ranch while Russell cleaned up the kitchen. The girl was full of energy and questions, wanting to know about Boston, about the ocean, about all the places Grace had been. Grace found herself relaxing in a way she had not since arriving in Nevada, enjoying the simple pleasure of Sarah's company. "You like my papa?" Sarah asked suddenly, with the bluntness of childhood. Grace felt her cheeks warm. "He seems like a very good man and a wonderful father." "He is lonely," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "He thinks I do not notice, but I do. He never goes to the dances in town or talks to the ladies at church. He just works and takes care of me." Grace did not know what to say to that. She was saved from having to respond by Russell's appearance on the porch. "Sarah, stop pestering Miss Vaughn with questions," he called. "She will think we have no manners at all." "I do not mind," Grace said truthfully. "Sarah is delightful company." The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange. Russell walked Grace to the wagon, and this time Sarah stayed on the porch, giving them a moment of privacy. "Thank you for coming," Russell said. "It meant a lot to Sarah." "We do not get many visitors." "Thank you for having me," Grace replied. "I enjoyed it very much." Russell helped her up onto the wagon seat, and for a moment their hands lingered together. Grace felt the warmth of his palm against hers, saw something shift in his blue eyes. Then he stepped back and the moment passed. "Drive carefully," he said. "The road can be treacherous in the dark." Grace nodded and picked up the reins. As she drove away, she glanced back once to see Russell standing in front of his house, watching her go, with Sarah waving enthusiastically from the porch. Something had shifted today. Some line had been crossed, and Grace was not sure whether to be thrilled or terrified. The weeks that followed established a pattern. Grace threw herself into teaching during the week, preparing lessons, working with individual students, and slowly earning the trust and respect of the community. On Sundays, she began attending church services in the small chapel that Reverend Colby presided over, and more often than not, she would see Russell and Sarah there, sitting in the third pew from the front. Russell had a habit of catching her eye during the service, and every time he did, Grace felt that same small flutter in her chest. After church, he would sometimes approach to discuss Sarah's progress, though these conversations had a way of drifting into other territory. They talked about books, about the land, about their dreams and disappointments. Grace found herself looking forward to these brief encounters with an intensity that surprised her. One afternoon in late September, Grace was working in the schoolhouse after dismissing the children when she heard a commotion outside. She went to the door to find a group of men on horseback riding past, looking dusty and trail-worn. One of them had a bloody bandage wrapped around his arm. Martha Henderson appeared at Grace's side, her face tight with worry. "Rustlers hit the Morrison ranch last night, stole about 50 head of cattle and shot Ben Morrison when he tried to stop them." "Is he all right?" Grace asked, alarmed. "He will live, but he is not happy." "The sheriff is organizing a posse to go after them." Martha's eyes scanned the street. "Lord help us. Half the men in town will want to go, including ones who have no business chasing outlaws." Grace felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Do you think Mr. Ashford will join them?" Martha gave her a knowing look. "Russell? Almost certainly. He is one of the best trackers in the county and he has a personal stake. Those rustlers have been operating in this area for months. It is only a matter of time before they hit his ranch." The thought of Russell riding off into danger made Grace's chest tighten with a fear that felt disproportionate to their acquaintance. But it was not just acquaintance anymore, she knew that. Over the past weeks, something had been growing between them, something neither of them had acknowledged openly, but that was as real as the desert sun. That evening, as Grace was preparing for bed, there was a knock at her door. Martha called up the stairs. "Miss Vaughn, you have a visitor." Grace descended to find Russell standing in the Hendersons' parlor, his hat in his hands. He looked tired, and there was a tension in his shoulders that had not been there before. "I am sorry to call so late," he said. "I wanted to let you know that I will be riding out with the posse tomorrow morning. We are going after the rustlers who hit the Morrison place." Grace folded her hands together to keep them from trembling. "That sounds dangerous." "It is necessary," Russell said. "These men are thieves and violent ones at that. They need to be stopped before someone else gets hurt." "What about Sarah?" Grace asked. "I am leaving her with my foreman's wife. She will be well cared for." Russell took a step closer, and his voice dropped lower. I wanted you to know in case anything happens. Sarah is fond of you. If something were to happen to me, I would rest easier knowing there was someone in town who cared about her welfare." The thought of Russell not coming back made Grace's throat tighten. "Nothing is going to happen to you. You will come back safely, and we will see you in church on Sunday as usual." Russell's expression softened. "You sound very certain of that." "I am," Grace said, though she felt anything but certain. "You have too much to live for." There was a long moment of silence, heavy with things unsaid. Then Russell reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture that was achingly tender. "When I get back," he said quietly, "there are things I would like to discuss with you, things I have been thinking about for weeks now." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Then you had better make sure you come back safely." Russell squeezed her hand once more, then released it. "I will do my best, Miss Vaughn." He left, and Grace stood in the parlor feeling like the world had shifted beneath her feet. Martha appeared from the kitchen, where she had been conspicuously absent during their conversation. "That man is in love with you," Martha said gently. "And unless I miss my guess, you feel the same way about him." Grace sank into a chair. "I barely know him. We have only spoken a handful of times." "Sometimes that is all it takes," Martha said. "When it is right, you just know. I knew with my Henry after 2 conversations. We have been married 26 years now." Grace pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. "I came here to teach, not to fall in love with a rancher." "Life has a way of surprising us," Martha said with a smile. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The next morning, Grace stood with many of the other townspeople as the posse rode out. Russell was near the front, sitting tall in his saddle, his rifle secured to his horse's flank. He caught sight of her in the crowd and tipped his hat, and Grace raised her hand in farewell, praying silently that he would return safely. The following days were among the longest of Grace's life. She taught her classes, but her mind kept drifting to Russell and the posse, wondering where they were, if they had found the rustlers, if anyone had been hurt. Sarah came to school each day, staying with the foreman's family as her father had arranged, and Grace made sure to give her extra attention. On the 3rd day, word came that there had been a confrontation. The posse had caught up with the rustlers near the California border. There had been gunfire, but the details were scarce. Grace felt sick with worry, unable to eat or sleep properly. She kept herself busy, but every sound made her start, hoping for news. Finally, on the 4th day, the posse returned. Grace was in the schoolhouse when she heard the commotion and rushed to the window. The men looked exhausted and battered, but they were riding in triumph, with several bound prisoners in their midst. Grace scanned the group desperately, her heart in her throat, and then she saw him. Russell was near the back, his face dusty and unshaven, but whole and alive. Relief flooded through her so intensely that her knees went weak. She gripped the windowsill, watching as the men dismounted and were greeted by their families. Sarah had been staying with her friend's family, and Grace saw the moment the girl spotted her father. She broke into a run, and Russell swept her up in his arms, holding her tight. Grace turned away from the window, pressing her hand to her mouth. The depth of her feeling terrified her. She had known Russell for less than 2 months, and yet the thought of losing him had been unbearable. What was happening to her? That evening, after she had dismissed the children, Russell appeared at the schoolhouse door. He looked tired but clean, having obviously bathed and changed clothes since returning. Grace's heart leaped at the sight of him. "You came back," she said unnecessarily. "I told you I would." Russell stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "We got the rustlers. They are in the sheriff's custody now. One of them had Ben Morrison's brand on several head of cattle, so there is no question about their guilt." "Was anyone hurt?" Grace asked. A few minor injuries, nothing serious. We were lucky." Russell moved closer, and Grace could see the exhaustion etched into his face, but also something else, something intense and focused. "I did a lot of thinking while I was out there, about what matters, about what I want from life." Grace's pulse quickened. "And what do you want?" "I want Sarah to have a good education and every opportunity to make something of herself," Russell said. "I want my ranch to thrive so I can leave her something of value. But more than any of that, I want to stop being alone. I want someone to share my life with, someone who understands what it means to work hard for something better." He was looking at her with such intensity that Grace could barely breathe. She had never been one for pretty words or grand romantic gestures. She had always been practical, focused on survival and propriety. But standing here in the dusty schoolhouse with Russell Ashford looking at her like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked, she felt something fundamental shift inside her. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "I did not expect to, I did not plan for it, but I do." Russell closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He took her hands in his, and Grace could feel the roughness of his calluses, the strength in his fingers. "Grace, I know we have not known each other long. I know I am just a rancher and you are an educated woman from the East, but I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. When I was out there chasing those rustlers, all I could think about was getting back here, back to you and Sarah. You have become part of what home means to me." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such raw honesty and vulnerability. In Boston, courtship had been a dance of carefully measured steps and proper etiquette. This was something entirely different, something real and vital and terrifying. "I am just a woman with debts and a past full of disappointments," Grace said shakily. "I do not know anything about being a rancher's wife or a mother to a little girl who has already suffered loss." "You know the important things," Russell said. "You know how to be kind. You know how to work hard. You know how to see people for who they really are, not just who they are supposed to be. Sarah adores you, and he took a breath, "I think I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, beautiful and impossible. Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she said. "I did not think it could happen this fast, but apparently my heart had other ideas." Russell laughed, a sound of pure joy and relief. Then he did something that made Grace's breath catch. He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "I am doing this all backward," he said. "I should court you properly, take you to dances, write you letters. But I am not good at waiting, and life out here has taught me not to waste time when I find something precious. Grace Vaughn, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and Sarah's mother? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy?" Grace looked down at this strong, honest man kneeling before her in the schoolhouse where she had come to build a new life. And she realized that this was her new life, this unexpected love, this chance at happiness she had never dared to hope for. "Yes," she said, and then louder, "Yes, I will marry you." Russell stood and pulled her into his arms, and Grace went willingly, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against hers. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, and then he was kissing her, gentle at first and then deeper, and Grace felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Russell rested his forehead against hers. "We should tell Sarah. She is going to be over the moon." Grace laughed, a little breathless. "How do you know?" "Because she has been asking me when I was going to propose to you since the day after you came to dinner." They walked together to the foreman's house to collect Sarah, and when they told her the news, the little girl shrieked with delight and threw her arms around both of them. "I knew it. I knew you were going to be my new mama." The word Mama caught Grace by surprise, and emotion welled up in her throat. She knelt down so she was at Sarah's level. "I would be honored to be your mama if you will have me, but I want you to know that I am not trying to replace your first mother. She will always be important, always be remembered." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Mama would have liked you. She wanted me to be educated and strong, and you are both of those things. She would be happy Papa chose you." Grace pulled the girl into a hug, and Russell wrapped his arms around both of them. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace felt like she had found her place in the world. The next weeks were a whirlwind of planning. Grace continued teaching, but now there was a new lightness to her days. She and Russell saw each other as often as their respective responsibilities allowed, usually on Sundays after church, and occasionally during the week when Russell had business in town. They talked about everything, learning each other's stories, their hopes and fears and dreams. Grace learned that Russell had come to Nevada from Missouri 10 years earlier with his new bride, seeking opportunity and adventure. They had bought the ranch with money his wife had inherited, and together they had built it into something successful. Her death in childbirth had nearly destroyed him, but Sarah had given him a reason to keep going. Russell learned about Grace's childhood in Boston, the daughter of a bookkeeper who had loved learning more than money. He heard about her father's gambling debts, discovered too late, and the shame of seeing their home and possessions sold off to pay creditors. He listened without judgment when she confessed her fear that she would never be able to fully repay what was owed, that she would spend her whole life in the shadow of her father's mistakes. "Those are his debts, not yours," Russell said firmly. They were sitting on the porch of the Henderson house, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. "You do not have to carry that burden alone anymore. When we marry, your troubles become my troubles. We will figure it out together." Grace felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "I am not accustomed to having someone to rely on." "You had better get accustomed to it," Russell said, taking her hand, "because I am not going anywhere." They decided to marry in late October, giving Grace time to finish her first term of teaching and make arrangements. Reverend Colby agreed to perform the ceremony, and Martha Henderson threw herself into planning with an enthusiasm that was both touching and slightly overwhelming. "You need a proper dress," Martha insisted. "We can alter my wedding gown. You are close to the size I was when I married Henry." Grace was moved by the offer but hesitant. "I could not take your wedding dress, Mrs. Henderson." "You are not taking it, you are borrowing it," Martha said firmly. "And please, call me Martha. We are going to be friends for a long time, I think." The dress was beautiful, made of cream-colored silk that had yellowed slightly with age but was still lovely. Martha and 2 other women from town worked for days altering it to fit Grace's taller, slimmer frame. When Grace finally tried on the finished product, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked like someone's bride, like someone worthy of being loved. Sarah was to be her bridesmaid, a role the girl took with utmost seriousness. She helped choose wildflowers for the bouquet and practiced walking slowly, as Martha instructed, at least a dozen times. Her excitement was infectious, and Grace found herself getting caught up in it, despite her natural tendency toward restraint. 2 days before the wedding, a letter arrived from Boston. Grace recognized her former landlady's handwriting and opened it with trepidation. Inside was a brief note and a check for a sum that made Grace gasp. The note read, "Dear Miss Vaughn, in going through your father's papers as you requested, I found a life insurance policy he had taken out years ago. The company has paid out the benefit, and after deducting what was owed for rent, the remainder is enclosed. I hope this brings you some peace. Your father loved you very much, whatever his faults. Best wishes, Mrs. Morrison. Grace stared at the check, her hands trembling. It was enough to pay off the remaining debts with money left over. She sank into a chair, overwhelmed by relief and grief in equal measure. Her father, careless and irresponsible as he had been, had still tried to provide for her in the only way he could. That evening, she showed the letter to Russell. They were at his ranch, sitting in the kitchen while Sarah played with the puppies outside. Russell read the letter carefully, then looked at Grace with understanding in his blue eyes. "This means you are free," he said quietly. "Free of the debts, free of the past. You do not have to marry me out of necessity anymore." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. "I never said yes because of necessity. I said yes because I love you. This," she gestured to the letter, "is just a gift, a blessing, but it does not change how I feel." Russell's expression cleared and he brought her hand to his lips. "I needed to hear that. I needed to know you were choosing this, choosing me because you wanted to, not because you had no other option." "I am choosing you," Grace said firmly. "I am choosing this life, this family. I am choosing love, Russell. Real, honest love." They kissed across the kitchen table, and when they pulled apart, both were smiling. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the late October air crisp with the promise of winter. Grace dressed in Martha's altered gown, her hair arranged in a simple style with wildflowers tucked into the waves. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw not the frightened, desperate woman who had arrived in Rhyolite 3 months ago, but someone stronger, someone who had found her place. The ceremony was held in the small chapel, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Grace walked down the aisle on Reverend Colby's arm, since she had no father to give her away, and her eyes found Russell standing at the front. He was wearing his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed, and the expression on his face when he saw her was one of such pure love that Grace felt tears prick her eyes. Sarah stood beside her father in a new blue dress, beaming with happiness. As Grace reached the front and took Russell's hands, the little girl whispered loudly enough for half the church to hear, "I told you she would say yes." Laughter rippled through the congregation, and even Reverend Colby smiled. The ceremony itself was simple and traditional. Grace and Russell exchanged vows to love and cherish each other, for better or worse, in sickness and health, as long as they both lived. When Russell slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Grace felt the weight of it like a promise, solid and real. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Colby said, and Russell did, sweetly and thoroughly, while the congregation applauded. The reception was held at the Henderson house, with tables set up in the yard and food brought by seemingly everyone in town. There was dancing to the accompaniment of a fiddle and guitar, and Grace found herself passed from partner to partner, as was traditional. But her eyes kept finding Russell across the crowded yard, and every time they did, he was watching her with that same look of wonder and love. As the sun began to set, Russell claimed her for a slow dance. They moved together easily despite Grace's limited experience with dancing, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Happy," Russell murmured against her hair. "Extraordinarily," Grace said. "I never imagined I could feel this way." "Neither did I," Russell admitted. "After Mary died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I would just focus on raising Sarah and running the ranch. I never expected to love again, certainly not like this." Grace pulled back just enough to see his face. "Like what?" "Like you are the air I breathe," Russell said simply. "Like I would do anything, be anything, to keep you safe and happy." They kissed there in the middle of the makeshift dance floor, surrounded by their friends and neighbors, and Grace felt like her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. Later that evening, they returned to the ranch, which was now Grace's home. Sarah had been invited to spend the night with her friend's family, giving the newlyweds some privacy. Russell carried Grace over the threshold, making her laugh, and set her down gently in the kitchen. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ashford," he said, and Grace loved the sound of her new name. They stood together in the quiet house, and Grace realized that this was real. This was her life now. She was married to Russell Ashford. She was Sarah's mother. She was a rancher's wife in the Nevada desert. It was nothing like the life she had planned, and yet it was perfect. That night, they came together with a tenderness and passion that left Grace breathless. Russell was gentle and patient, mindful that this was her first time, and the intimacy they shared felt like the natural extension of everything they had been building together. Afterward, lying in Russell's arms, Grace felt a peace she had never known before. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Russell replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for taking a chance on a rancher and his little girl." "Thank you for seeing me," Grace said, "for seeing who I really am." They fell asleep tangled together, and Grace dreamed of the future, of the life they would build together in this harsh, beautiful land. The next months were a period of adjustment and discovery. Grace continued teaching, though she now had the added responsibilities of managing the household and being a mother to Sarah. It was challenging to balance everything, but Russell was an equal partner, helping with chores when he could and taking on more of Sarah's care during busy school weeks. Sarah thrived under the arrangement, delighting in having a mother again. She followed Grace around the house when she was home, asking endless questions and offering to help with everything. Grace taught her to cook and sew, and in return, Sarah taught Grace about the ranch, about the cattle and horses and the rhythms of life on the land. Grace discovered that she loved ranch life more than she had expected. There was something satisfying about the physical work, about seeing tangible results from her efforts. She learned to tend the garden, to preserve food for winter, to mend fences and care for chickens. Her hands, which had once been soft and uncalloused, grew stronger and more capable. Winter came to the desert, bringing cold nights and occasional snow. The schoolhouse was drafty, and Grace worked with Russell to insulate it better and improve the heating stove. Several of her students brought wood from their family supplies, and the community came together to ensure the children could learn in comfort. In December, a severe storm hit the region, bringing heavy snow and freezing temperatures. School was canceled for a week, and Grace found herself snowed in at the ranch with Russell and Sarah. At first, she worried about being cooped up, but those days turned into some of the happiest of her life. They played games by the fireplace, read books aloud, and talked for hours. Russell taught Grace to play chess, and Sarah learned to bake bread. In the evenings, after Sarah was asleep, Grace and Russell would sit together by the fire, and Russell would tell her stories about the land, about the history of the territory, about his dreams for the future. "I want to expand the herd next spring," he said one night, his arm around Grace as she leaned against him. "Maybe buy some of the land to the east, build something that will last, something Sarah can inherit if she wants it." "What if she does not want to be a rancher?" Grace asked curiously. Russell smiled. "Then she can sell it and use the money for whatever she does want. I just want to give her options, the way my parents never gave me." "Tell me about them," Grace said. She knew Russell's parents were both dead, but he rarely spoke of them. "My father was a farmer in Missouri," Russell said slowly. "A hard man, very set in his ways. He expected me to take over the farm, could not understand why I wanted something different. When I married Mary and told him we were going west, he disowned me, told me I was throwing my life away." He paused, his jaw tight. "He died 5 years ago. We never reconciled." Grace squeezed his hand. "I am sorry. I made my peace with it," Russell said, "but it taught me something important. I want Sarah to know that I will support her choices, whatever they are. I want her to follow her own path, not the one I think she should take." "You are a good father," Grace said softly. "The best kind." Russell kissed the top of her head. "I am trying to be. That is all any of us can do." As winter gave way to spring, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The realization came slowly, a gradual understanding of the changes in her body. When she finally told Russell, he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "Another child," he said wonderingly. "A brother or sister for Sarah." Sarah was equally thrilled when they told her, immediately making plans for all the things she would teach the baby. Grace watched her stepdaughter's enthusiasm with a full heart, grateful beyond measure for this family she had found. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, despite the physical demands of Grace's life. She continued teaching through the spring term, finally stopping in May when climbing the steps to the schoolhouse became too difficult. The school board agreed to hire a temporary replacement for the last month of school, and Grace focused on preparing for the baby's arrival. Russell was attentive and careful, worrying over every twinge and discomfort. His concern was born of the memory of losing Mary, Grace knew, and she did her best to reassure him. Dr. Harrison, the town's only physician, examined her regularly and pronounced her healthy and strong. "You are built for this," the doctor said with a smile. "I do not anticipate any problems." The baby came in late June, during the hottest part of the summer. Grace went into labor in the early morning, and Russell rode into town to fetch Dr. Harrison while Sarah stayed with her, holding her hand and bringing her water. By the time the doctor arrived, the labor was well advanced. "You are doing beautifully," Dr. Harrison said encouragingly. "It will not be much longer now." Russell stayed with her throughout, despite the doctor's suggestion that he wait outside as was traditional. Grace gripped his hand through each contraction, drawing strength from his presence. When the final pushing stage came, she bore down with all her strength, and suddenly the baby was there, wailing lustily. "It is a boy," Dr. Harrison announced, wrapping the infant in a clean cloth. "A fine, healthy boy." Russell's face was wet with tears as he looked down at his son. "A boy," he repeated wonderingly. Then he looked at Grace, and the love in his eyes was overwhelming. Thank you for this gift." Grace was exhausted but elated as she held her newborn son. He had a cap of dark hair and his father's blue eyes, and she felt an instant, fierce love for him. Sarah was allowed in to meet her new brother, and she sat on the edge of the bed, gently touching his tiny hand. "He is so small," she whispered. "What are we going to name him?" Grace and Russell had discussed names but had not settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Grace said, "What about Matthew? It means gift of God, and that is exactly what he is." Russell smiled. "Matthew Ashford, I like it. Welcome to the world, Matthew." The weeks after Matthew's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feeding. Grace was grateful for Russell's help, and for Martha Henderson, who came out to the ranch several times to assist with cooking and laundry. Sarah proved to be a devoted big sister, always eager to hold the baby or fetch whatever was needed. Grace had wondered if she would be able to love a biological child more than she loved Sarah, but she discovered that love did not work that way. Her heart had simply expanded, making room for all of them. Sarah was her daughter as much as Matthew was her son, and the bond between them only deepened as they navigated the challenges of the new family dynamic together. By the time fall arrived and Grace was ready to return to teaching, she found herself torn. She loved teaching, loved the feeling of making a difference in her students' lives. But she also loved being home with her children, watching them grow and learn. After much discussion with Russell, they decided that Grace would take one more year off from teaching to care for Matthew while he was still small. The school board agreed, rehiring the temporary teacher for another term. It felt strange not to be in the schoolhouse when September came, but Grace quickly found that being a full-time mother and rancher's wife kept her plenty busy. She started a small lending library in their home, inviting families from the area to come borrow books. She gave informal lessons to some of the mothers who had never learned to read properly. She helped Russell with the ranch accounts and planning, discovering that she had a head for numbers and organization. The ranch prospered. Russell's careful management and hard work paid off, and they were able to buy the adjacent land he had spoken of, expanding their holdings significantly. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the increased workload, young men who lived in the bunkhouse Russell built near the barn. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Winters were spent close to home, focused on indoor tasks and weathering storms. Springs and summers were busy with ranching work, branding cattle, mending fences, and all the 100 tasks that kept a ranch running. Falls were for harvest and preparation for winter, preserving food and stocking supplies. Sarah grew into a bright, capable young woman. She continued her education, reading voraciously from Grace's collection and the books they ordered from catalogs. When she turned 13, she announced that she wanted to be a veterinarian, a profession almost unheard of for women. Grace and Russell supported her ambition wholeheartedly, even when neighbors suggested it was impractical. "If that is what you want, we will find a way to make it happen," Russell told his daughter. "You can do anything you set your mind to." Matthew grew into a lively, curious child who adored his big sister and followed his father everywhere when allowed. He learned to ride almost before he could walk properly, and he had no fear of the cattle or horses. Russell taught him about the ranch, about respecting the land and the animals, about doing hard work with integrity. Grace watched her family grow and thrive with a gratitude that never faded. On quiet evenings, sitting on the porch with Russell while the children played in the yard, she would think about how close she had come to missing all of this. If she had not been desperate enough to come west, if she had not taken the teaching position in Rhyolite, if Russell had not walked into that schoolhouse on her first week, her life would have been so different, so much smaller. When Sarah turned 16, she began talking seriously about going to college. There were a few veterinary schools in the country that accepted women, though the path would not be easy. Grace and Russell started saving money specifically for her education, determined to give her every opportunity. "Are you sure about this?" Russell asked his daughter one evening. "It will mean leaving home, going far away where we cannot protect you." Sarah smiled, and Grace saw so much of Russell in her expression, the same determination and quiet strength. "I am sure, Papa. You and Grace taught me to go after what I want, to not let fear or other people's opinions stop me. This is what I want." "Then you will have it," Russell said, pulling her into a hug. "Your mother would be so proud of you, both your mothers," he added, glancing at Grace. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. Over the years, she and Russell had made sure Sarah knew about Mary, about the woman who had given birth to her and loved her even though their time together had been brief. There were photographs displayed in the house, and stories shared. Grace had never wanted to erase Mary's memory, and she was grateful that Russell honored both the women in his life. 2 years later, they put Sarah on a train to California, where she would attend the veterinary program at a progressive college. It was one of the hardest things Grace had ever done, watching the train pull away with her daughter on it, but she was also bursting with pride. "She is going to do amazing things," Russell said, his arm around Grace as they watched the train disappear into the distance. "I know," Grace said. We raised her right. With Sarah away at school, the ranch felt quieter. Matthew, now 6 years old, seemed to sense the change and became even more attached to his parents. Grace threw herself into her lending library project, which had grown significantly. She also started teaching again part-time, working with the children who lived too far from town to attend regular school. Letters from Sarah arrived regularly, full of stories about her classes and the people she was meeting. She excelled in her studies, though she faced significant prejudice from male students and some professors who believed women had no place in veterinary medicine. But Sarah persisted, drawing on the strength and determination her parents had instilled in her. 3 years into her program, Sarah wrote with exciting news. She had met a young man, a fellow veterinary student named Daniel Porter. He treated her as an equal, valued her opinions, and shared her passion for animal medicine. She wrote cautiously, falling in love. Grace and Russell read the letter together in the kitchen, and Grace saw a flicker of something painful cross her husband's face. "She is growing up," he said quietly. "Soon she will not need us anymore." "She will always need us," Grace said firmly, "just in different ways." "And is it not what we wanted? For her to find someone who values and respects her?" Russell nodded slowly. "You are right. I just miss her." "I miss her too," Grace said. "But we did our job. We raised her to be strong and independent and capable of making her own choices. Now we have to trust her." Daniel came home with Sarah for Christmas that year, and Grace and Russell both approved of him immediately. He was a serious young man with kind eyes and a genuine passion for his work. More importantly, the way he looked at Sarah, with respect and admiration and love, told them everything they needed to know. Sarah graduated at the top of her class and married Daniel 6 months later in a ceremony held at the ranch. Grace helped her dress in a beautiful gown they had ordered from San Francisco, and Russell walked her down the makeshift aisle with tears streaming down his face. "Take care of her," Russell told Daniel gruffly after the ceremony. Daniel smiled. "I will, sir. Though I suspect she is quite capable of taking care of herself." "That she is," Russell agreed, "but it is still nice to have someone to share the burden with." Sarah and Daniel settled in Colorado, where they opened a veterinary practice together, treating both ranch animals and household pets. They visited the ranch often, and Sarah wrote long letters describing their work and their life together. Meanwhile, Matthew was growing into a young man himself. At 12, he was already showing the same dedication to ranch work that Russell had, spending hours learning about cattle breeding, land management, and all the skills he would need to eventually run the ranch himself. But he also had his mother's love of learning, reading everything he could get his hands on and asking endless questions. When Matthew was 14, he asked Grace about her past, about Boston and her father, and why she had come west. They were sitting on the porch in the evening, watching the sunset, and Grace found herself telling him the whole story, the debts, the desperation, the fear that she would never amount to anything. "But you became a teacher," Matthew said. "You taught all those children, including Sarah. You started the library. You helped build this ranch into what it is today. That is amounting to something." Grace smiled at her son, her heart full. "I suppose it is. But the most important thing I did was say yes when your father proposed. That changed everything." "Do you ever regret leaving Boston?" Matthew asked. "Coming to such a different place?" Grace thought about it seriously before answering. "No, I regret the circumstances that made it necessary. I regret my father's choices and the pain they caused, but I do not regret coming here. This is where I found my life, my real life. This is where I found love and family and purpose. I would not trade that for anything." On their 20th wedding anniversary, Russell surprised Grace with a gift. He had been working in secret with a craftsman in Carson City to create a beautiful wooden sign for the ranch. It read, Ashford Ranch, established 1877 by Russell and Grace Ashford. "I want people to know this is ours," Russell said as they stood looking at the sign, newly mounted at the entrance to their property. "Everything we have built together. You are not just my wife, Grace. You are my partner in every sense of the word." Grace turned to him, this man she had fallen in love with so unexpectedly, and cupped his face in her hands. His hair was graying now, and there were lines around his eyes, but he was still the same Russell who had walked into her schoolhouse all those years ago and changed her life forever. "I love you," she said simply, "more now than even on the day we married." "And I love you," Russell replied, "every single day more and more." They kissed there by the ranch sign, two people who had taken a chance on each other and built something beautiful from it. The years continued to pass. Sarah and Daniel had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and Grace delighted in being a grandmother. The children visited the ranch often, and Grace loved teaching them to read and sharing stories of their mother's childhood. Matthew showed no interest in leaving for college, preferring to stay and work the ranch. When he turned 21, Russell made him an equal partner in the business, recognizing all the work and dedication his son had put in. Matthew proved to have innovative ideas about cattle breeding and land management, helping the ranch continue to prosper even as times changed. When Matthew was 23, he met a young woman named Emma at a church social in Rhyolite. She was the daughter of a mine owner, educated and spirited, and Matthew was immediately smitten. He courted her properly, with Russell's bemused approval, and they married a year later. Emma proved to be a perfect addition to the family, getting along well with Grace and throwing herself into ranch life with enthusiasm. Grace stepped back from most of her outside activities, content to focus on family and the ranch. But she still maintained her lending library, and she still helped children who struggled with reading or arithmetic. At 50, she felt more fulfilled and purposeful than she ever had in her youth. Russell's health began to decline when he was 62. It started with small things, more fatigue than usual, occasional shortness of breath. Dr. Harrison examined him and delivered the news that his heart was weakening. There was no cure, only time and rest and trying to preserve what strength remained. Grace felt like her own heart was breaking as she helped Russell adjust to his new limitations. This strong man who had worked so hard all his life, who had built something from nothing, now struggled to walk from the house to the barn. But Russell faced it with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. "I've had a good life," he told Grace one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching Matthew and Emma work with the cattle in the distance. "Better than I ever deserved. I have no regrets, Grace, none at all." "You deserve everything good," Grace said fiercely, holding his hand tight. "Everything." Russell's decline was slow but steady. He lived to see Matthew and Emma's first child, a son they named Russell in his honor. He held his grandson and smiled, and Grace could see the peace in his eyes. On a cool evening in early spring, with the desert beginning to bloom after winter rains, Russell died quietly in his sleep with Grace beside him. She woke to find him gone, his face peaceful, and she wept for the loss of the man who had been her partner, her love, her best friend for 35 years. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half the county. Russell had been respected and liked, known for his fairness and integrity. Sarah and Daniel came from Colorado with their children. Matthew and Emma were there, of course, and Martha Henderson, now elderly but still spry, held Grace's hand throughout the service. In the weeks after Russell's death, Grace felt unmoored. Everything she saw, everywhere she looked, reminded her of him. The ranch they had built together, the family they had created, the life they had shared. The grief was overwhelming at times, but so too was the gratitude. She had been loved deeply and well. She had loved in return. That was something no one could take from her. Matthew and Emma took over running the ranch, and they did it well, honoring Russell's legacy while adding their own innovations. Grace remained involved in an advisory capacity, but mostly she focused on her grandchildren and on preserving the family's history. She wrote down stories of the early days, of how she had come to Rhyolite, of how Russell had proposed in the schoolhouse, of building a life in the desert. When Grace was 75, Sarah convinced her to move to Colorado to be closer to family. Grace agreed reluctantly, sad to leave the ranch but recognizing that she needed more support as she aged. She lived with Sarah and Daniel in a comfortable room with windows that overlooked the mountains. On quiet afternoons, Grace would sit in her chair and remember. She remembered the terrified young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Rhyolite, desperate and alone. She remembered Russell's blue eyes and gentle proposal. She remembered Sarah's joy at having a mother again and Matthew's first cry. She remembered every sunrise over the desert, every storm weathered together, every moment of laughter and tears and simple, ordinary happiness. She had thought once that her life was over when her father died and left her with nothing. But she had been wrong. Her life had been just beginning. It had begun when she came to teach at the schoolhouse, and it had truly started when the rancher's proposal taught her about real love. Grace died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. At her request, she was buried in Rhyolite, next to Russell, on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The headstone reads simply, "Grace Ashford, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and teacher. She chose love and lived well." Years later, when Matthew's great-granddaughter asked about the history of the ranch, he pulled out the stories Grace had written and read them aloud. He told the tale of a schoolteacher from Boston and a rancher who loved her, of how they had built something lasting from nothing but hope and hard work and love. The ranch still bore their name, still stood as a testament to what they had created together. And in the retelling of that story, Grace and Russell lived on, their love echoing through generations, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is take a chance on an unexpected future and see where it leads.